Thank you, Dale. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Please raise your hand if you've been to Hong Kong. I'm sure all of you have. I'm not going to ask anyone who hasn't been to Hong Kong. Raise your hand again if you've been to Hong Kong within the past 2 to 3 years. So much fewer people. It's my pleasure to talk about the subject about Hong Kong, how did we get here and where are we going? And I have to start out with a disclaimer. I am not a China expert. I don't have a PhD in Chinese economics and Mandarin and so forth. I agreed with Dale to do this talk because she mentioned that she would pay me a lot of zeros. But there's no number in front of the zeros. So at the end of November, the United States unanimously passed in Congress, and President Trump signed 2 pieces of legislation. One is called the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which allows the government to penalize people who, in both China and Hong Kong, who are abusive of human rights in Hong Kong. And the second one is called the Protect Hong Kong Act. And this limited U.S. commercial enterprises from selling non-lethal crowd control devices, whether it's tear gas, pepper spray, and the like, to the police of Hong Kong. Both pieces of legislation were passed unanimously in both houses by a voice vote, and President Trump signed them into law at the end of November. So it seems pretty simple. You know, these are the protesters in Hong Kong are people that are fighting for their freedoms. They've attracted the support and the emotions of the American people, who are all in favor of freedoms and democracy. And you know, what could be more simple than that? The problem is, it isn't simple. In fact, it's complicated. It's very complicated. And I'm going to go through different aspects of that, plus a little history of how we got to where we are right now. I'm going to start with a story, which is a tragic story. This story takes place, it starts in February of 2018. A 20-year-old Hong Kong man with the surname of Chan and his 19-year-old Hong Kong girlfriend with the surname of Poon go to Taiwan for a vacation together. And while there, she tells him that she is pregnant by another guy. He gets enraged and he murders her in Taiwan. He packs her body apparently into a suitcase, leaves it in a park in Taiwan, flees to Hong Kong, and is eventually caught, and he's charged and convicted of certain financial irregularities because he used her credit card and her ATM card to withdraw money. He goes to jail for about a year or 14 months, and he's been out since October. Miss Poon's family is apoplectic. They go to the chief executive, Carrie Lam, which is the equivalent of the governor from the old colonial days, and they say to her, you've got to do something. You've got to do something. They meet with her 5 times. And she said, I can't do anything because there's no extradition treaty between Hong Kong and Taiwan. Does anyone know why there isn't one? There can't be one. Because from one country, exactly correct. There can't be one because Hong Kong and Macau are part of mainland China, and the one thing that mainland China and Taiwan agree on at the moment, although this may change in Taiwan, is that there's only one China, and they don't recognize each other as legitimate states, and so it's impossible to have a normal interstate or interstate, not intercountry extradition agreement. So in the meantime, Beijing has been concerned about the issue of extradition and the fact that Hong Kong has become a bolt hole for Chinese criminals. They were estimated to be some 300 millionaires from the mainland holed up in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong even has a major real estate guy named Joseph Lau, who was wanted by Macau for corruption. And Macau said, send him to us. And Hong Kong said, we can't. There's no legal jurisdiction for us to send Joseph Lau to Macau. So the government started the process a year later after the murder in February of 2019 of putting out the so-called extradition bill. And the extradition bill
where's John?
was not particularly well drafted. It didn't really reach the consciousness of most people until the early June, when it was slated for the first reading in Hong Kong's Legislative Council, which occurred. And as a result of that, all of a sudden, 1 million people hit the streets in Hong Kong. Peaceful protests, almost entirely peaceful protests. And they're opposed to this. Why are they opposed to it? Because China has a very high conviction record. Someone analyzed, I think it was Guangxi province, the criminal cases there, and the very clever police and prosecutors of China are able to secure a 99.9% conviction rate. So, I mean, it goes without saying that China does not offer the kind of protections that we're used to in the common law in Hong Kong and in the United States. And this became the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back in terms of local people, because of the perception of encroachments on the basic law deal, which I'll get to in a moment. So now I'm going to backtrack a bit. I'm going to go to the 19th century because I want you to understand a couple basic things. By the 1830s, Great Britain and the US and other countries who were trading with China had a couple problems to deal with. Same problems we have today. China was selling far more than they were buying. And they sold in exchange for Mexican silver, and they just weren't buying enough British woolens and clocks and whatever else it was that Britain had for sale to the Chinese. On top of that, the Chinese would not allow the British and foreign trading firms to stay more than a couple months twice a year in the Whampoa and the Canton area, which Hong Kong is a part of. And so the trading companies would set up what were called factories. They weren't manufacturing anything. A better word would have been a trading post. And they were there in November and in, I guess it's May of every year for a couple of months. And then they had to shutter everything up, post a guard, and go home. Well, anyone who runs a business knows that those are not ideal trading circumstances. And so to treat the first problem, the British East Asia Company and Jardine Matheson and others who were dealing in India thought, it would be a great idea to bring Indian opium to China. They're going to like this. And they didn't introduce it, by the way, for the first time. It was already there, but it wasn't there in the kind of quantities that turned out.
This was in the 30s?
1830s. 1830s. We're in the 19th century, in the 1830s. So they did. They brought, what are they called? Casks of, or chests, I should say, of opium. And in an action which we can appreciate as Americans, a la the Boston Tea Party, the Chinese in South China reacted by dumping 20,000 casks or chests of opium into the Whampoa River, into the river. And of course that was unacceptable to the British. There were clarion calls for war in Parliament. An expedition went out. They whipped the Chinese army easily in South China. By the way, this started in 1839. This was the first Opium War. And by 1842, in the Treaty of, I think it was the Treaty of Nanjing, the Opium War was over, and a so-called corrupt local official in China ceded in perpetuity Hong Kong Island, and then across the harbor, the Kowloon Peninsula. kind of the equivalent of Manhattan and maybe Queens or the Bronx, whichever direction you're looking at. And so the British colonies started there. China was then racked by other problems. This was the first of many actions which basically you could describe as foreign nations eating China alive in the 19th century. And it's important to know this because this is where they come from. They didn't like it then, and they don't like it now. And I have to state in parentheses that in all the reading I've done to bone up and try to be as informative as I can for this lecture, I don't think I've read one analysis of the Chinese point of view. They report what China says, but there's not any reporting about why they're doing what they're doing based on in this case, the Basic Law and the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Okay, so quickly, from 1850 to 1864, there was a Taiping Rebellion, it's called, an enormous civil war not too far from Hong Kong and South and Southeast China, where a crazy guy who described himself as the brother of Jesus and with a lot of rabid, sort of Christian followers, waged war against the decaying Manchu emperor. Remember, I think it was in the 1630s, the Manchus from Manchuria conquered China. These are not Han Chinese. They have their own, they're a different group of people. They have a different language, and they have a different script, different writing than Chinese have. And that is still described to this day as probably the most bloody civil war that ever took place. 20 to 30 million people killed during that 14-year period, 1850 to 1864. The encroachments of foreign powers, which were in the high water mark of their colonial expansions, continued. There was a second war. The Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion broke out in the late 1890s. It resulted in the siege of the legations in Beijing. This may trigger some memories of yours. And first thing they did, it was a rebellion against Christian missionaries in North China, and then a rebellion against all foreigners. They didn't want them there. And the armies of some 12 different foreign countries, including the United States, by the way, I think it's a fair statement. Yeah, I'm putting aside the Mexican War. It was an overseas deployment by the U.S. Marines. They were involved as well. Long story short, they rescued the legations in Beijing and ultimately saved the regime from the so-called Boxers. The Boxers weren't into boxing. It was a shorthand expression for the name they called themselves in Chinese. But look at the turmoil. By 1911, the Qing dynasty, which was the Manchu dynasty, was finished, and the Republic of China was started with Sun Yat-sen as leader. And from the period 1911 to 1949, there was nothing but turmoil in China. There was not any peaceful time. There was warlordism. The Chinese Communist Party started in Shanghai in the late 1919, something like that. You know about Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who led the nationalists. There was civil war. There was invasion by the Japanese in 1931, and a re-invasion in 1937 with the famous rape of Nanking, which was an enormous slaughter. And finally, when the Japanese were defeated, the so-called truce, which wasn't much of one, between the communists and the nationalists was over, and they fought it out to see who was going to be the rightful heirs to China. The communists won. The nationalists fled to Taiwan and took, by the way, a lot of the treasures, the imperial treasures from Beijing, and established, the Taiwan as the Republic of China, it's called, which is there today. And the Chinese the Communist Party established the People's Republic of China. And Mao Zedong, who was the leader, said, when that was done in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China has stood up. China has stood up. So, fast forward to about 1979. I'm not going to go through the whole history of China, but there were plenty of problems from the Cultural Revolution, Great Famine, and Great Famine followed by the Cultural Revolution. Finally, Mao dies, and Deng Xiaoping takes over. Was rehabilitated twice under Mao, and he becomes a new leader. In 1979 is finally the opening up to the West. And Deng Xiaoping makes a statement, which is one of my favorite statements of all time, having lived there for 41 years, saying, it doesn't matter if it's a black cat or a white cat as long as it catches mice. The reason why I say it's my favorite is that my personal experience in dealing with Chinese people in Hong Kong is that they are eminently practical, pragmatic, problem-solving people. They want to know how to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. And it was refreshing to see that statement made after a 30-year blanket or 20-year blanket of communism. It had not snuffed out the normal sort of Chinese cultural drivers. But in dealing with Taiwan, what to do about Taiwan? Deng Xiaoping also came up with the one country, two systems model. One country, two systems. What's that? Deng Xiaoping announced that if Taiwan would rejoin the motherland and be part, as both Taiwan and Beijing, Taipei and Beijing agreed, part of one country, they could continue their capitalist, democratic system, financial system, legal system, the rest of it, within the umbrella of the mainland, the one country, two systems approach. The first place where this one country, two systems approach was tried was Hong Kong in effective July 1st, 1997. And the second place was Macau, which was effective, I think it was December 19th, 1999, 2 years later. So these two territories have, quote unquote, come back to China. But it wasn't an easy process in Hong Kong. I was there. I've been there since 1978. The problems began to arise as early as even 1977. Why? Because typically banks make home mortgages in Hong Kong. They don't do 30 years, which we're used to in the United States. They do 20 years. And 20 years after 1977 is 1997. How do we know what the rule of law is going to be? How do we know whether we're going to get our money back, the banks are worried about? So the concerns about that and the fact of the impending termination, I skipped a point, of the new territories. Let me go back a minute. In 1998, at the time of towards the end of the Boxer Rebellion, Britain needed more land to augment what it had in Hong Kong. And so it signed a 99-year lease for the so-called new territories, which stretched from Boundary Street in Kowloon, about 20 to 23 miles up to the Lo Wu border of China. But that lease clearly expired by June 30th, 1997. Just so you know, the Chinese governments have never accepted that lease as being valid, nor have they ever accepted the ceding of Hong Kong and the Kowloon Peninsula as having been valid either. But nevertheless, Britain, as a country that had to live up to its obligations, saw that there was a problem. And there were all sorts of ideas floated in the late 70s and early 80s. Well, maybe Hong Kong could become independent, like Singapore. Or maybe we didn't need the new territories, but that didn't work because the power plants are out there. It's just too much integrated. It would be like, if you can imagine just the island of Manhattan living on its own without any of the areas around it, let alone the country. Maybe the colony could continue. None of those were acceptable to China, because you have to remember, China is very sensitive on two subjects. One is reclaiming the territorial integrity of China, and second is maintaining law and order, peace, because they went through a Hobbesian period in the 19th century and the 20th century of slaughter and civil war, and even through, of course, Mao's period. I mean, he didn't help much either. So the notion that these are the prime goals of China should never be far from your mind. So what was the deal? There were negotiations for a number of years, and I remember the time, every time everyone's breathless, you know, what's happening? And we always got the same response. We had useful and constructive discussions. Useful and constructive discussions. But lo and behold, by September of 1984, they initialed a draft Sino-British joint declaration about the future of Hong Kong. And that was signed on December 19th of the same year, 1984. And what did it say? It said that Hong Kong would continue under its own laws, its own economy, its own social structure, as with a high degree of autonomy, quote unquote, as a special administrative region, an SAR, of the People's Republic of China. The new governor of Hong Kong was not going to be called governor, because that was too colonialistic, but it mirrored exactly the relation that the British governor had with London. That is, he had two responsibilities, or currently she was a woman governor, chief executive. One is to administer Hong Kong, and secondly, to report to Beijing, just like the British governor had to administer Hong Kong and report to London. And on the legal system, it would continue, the common law would continue, but under the British, the final appeal, as some of you may know, we're lawyers, in the British Commonwealth is to the House of Lords. That's really the Supreme Court. I mean, there are not a lot of cases appealed to the House of Lords, but that's where it goes. And in the case of China, they simply mirrored the same system. It would go to the Standing Committee of the, the People's, I can't remember, people, it's a bunch of initials, but anyway, a Standing Committee of the sorry? It would go to Beijing. And in fact, I'll get to it later, but I'll get to it now. The Standing Committee in Beijing has ruled already 4 times on Hong Kong constitutional matters. As a general rule, it's supposed to, questions that are constitutional are supposed to go up through the Hong Kong courts to the highest court in Hong Kong, which is the Court of Final Appeal, and then it's sent, if there's still an appeal, it can be sent to the Standing Committee of the People's Congress, whatever it is. So, regarding, there are a couple important things though. Remember I said to you that foreign affairs are to be reserved to Beijing. And so when a Hong Kong person is traveling overseas, he carries a Chinese passport. If he loses his passport, there's no Hong Kong embassy to go to. He goes to the embassy of the People's Republic of China. Britain, before it left, did a number of things. Governor Chris Patten pushed a democratization project through the Legislative Council, and more and more seats became available for election, but not much. And secondly, the British, as agreed, rescinded their treason, sedition, secession laws, completely wiped out. And Article 23 of the basic law is the so-called mini-constitution, but there's an important caveat I'll mention in a moment, that governs the law of Hong Kong. This took 5 years to negotiate between a joint PRC Hong Kong legal group, and they finally agreed on everything. And it was said that after the handover, which we knew was the end of June 1997, that Hong Kong would pass a new Article 23 that treated issues of treason, sedition, secession, and the like. That's never been done. It's never been done, still to this day. So, on universal suffrage, it said that over time there would be universal suffrage, and I'll get to that, I'll go back to that in a minute. So where are we? When the Sino-British joint declaration was issued, there was a giant sigh of relief. Everybody was happy in Hong Kong, in Beijing, which was getting its territory back for a 50-year period, but not necessarily a maximum period, which would start in July 1st, 1997 and end on June 30th, 2047. There was a lot of pro-China statements from Hong Kong people. However, a number of people, a pretty good number of people, still left Hong Kong for Canada, Australia, England, the United States, and other places, just in case. And they eventually started coming back. The number of immigrants is not well known. It's not clear, I should say, because each of these people still had Hong Kong citizenship, evidenced by their Hong Kong ID card. And if you come in with your Hong Kong ID card, even though you've got your Canadian citizenship, they don't really know whether you're a Canadian citizen or not. But it's estimated somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people availed themselves of this. Just to put that number in perspective, at the end of World War II, there were 600,000 people living in Hong Kong. And by 1997, the figure was 6.5 million. So the population had grown more than 10 times. Okay. They started coming back, and they were called astronauts because they had businesses in Canada, but they're coming back to Hong Kong because everybody loves Hong Kong because of the food. And it's a Chinese place, but it's Western, and it's easy to make money there. So everything was hunky-dory for the first 5, even 10 years of the handover period. However, there have been a number of issues that have arisen, and they fall, for the most part, in areas of Beijing's particular concern, which I've expressed to you, and which were provided for in the basic law. Number one, in 2003, the government said we're going to put out a proposed Article 23, treason and sedition law, and 500,000 people hit the streets in Hong Kong and said no. Why? Of course, they're afraid that they might be somehow convicted and then sent off to China for some reason. So that, as I said, even to this day, you can plot to commit treason in Hong Kong against the PRC, and you're not violating any Hong Kong law. Some years later, there was a proposal to institute national education, quote unquote, in Hong Kong. What's that? That's the story of China as told by China, which is somewhat anti-Western. It kind of focuses on the Opium War period to the present. And that was kicked back as well. People, no, we don't want it. We want to tell our story the way we tell our story. There were protests in 2012. When are we going to directly elect the chief executive, the new governor? Okay, no response to that. That was a fail. And in 2014, there was the famous umbrella movement, which you may have heard about. It was similar to Occupy Wall Street now. Young people for the most part, went out and they occupied streets. And their issue was universal suffrage. They wanted the right to vote, and they wanted to vote for the chief executive. What was finally decided, although there was some, I don't remember it exactly, and I didn't have time to get it. There was some glitch in the Legislative Council because there was some movement to open this up. But what was decided when I think the pro-democracy people were out to lunch and this legislation proceeded anyway, was that there would be a 1,200-person nominating committee who would both nominate and select the new chief executive. And the requirements of that person were, there were 3 candidates, were that they had to love Hong Kong and love the mainland, whatever that meant. That's obviously a subjective test, but you can understand where the Chinese are coming from. And Carrie Lam won 770 votes out of a little under 1,200 votes in 2017. They are the ones who elected her, not the general electorate. And she has a 5-year term from 2017 to March, the next election, which is March of 2022. In the meanwhile, let's go look at the legislature for a minute. The legislature had opened up to more direct voting. Hong Kong has a unicameral legislature, but they're all they all have the same vote. There's not like it's not like the senators in the House of Representatives are somehow in the same house. It's just one house. It used to have 60 legislators, 30 of which were directly elected by various geographical areas, and since July 1st, 1997, people like me, who had been in Hong Kong for at least 7 years and had a permanent ID, could vote and did vote in local elections. The other 30 were composed of the so-called functional constituencies. This was not new. This is what the British had instituted since, I think, the late 50s. What were they? The British, the Legislative Council at the time was all appointed, but they thought it was a good idea, and it was not a bad idea, to have representatives of each of the various industry and commerce groups represented in the legislature. So you had, hospitals and medicine, and shipbuilding and labor. Everyone had one vote except labor, which had 3 votes. And a whole, actually there are 28 functional constituencies. In the 20-teens, and I don't remember the exact date, that number was expanded to 70 legislators. So there are 35 directly elected by the geographic areas of Hong Kong, and the other 35 by the functional constituencies. But 5 of those are actually not functional constituencies. They are chosen by the district councils. And I'll get to that in a minute, but these are the ones we just had a vote in on November 24th. So the net result of that is that of the 70 legislators we have in Hong Kong, 40 of the 70, which is 57%, are actually directly elected. And it's been creeping up over 20 years and 30 years, even during the late British colonial period. And I make a point to mention it because it's not like you can't have it. It's been, if you work with Chinese people, there's a lot of give and take and, step-by-step motion to do things. So that's the state of what the place looks like legally. Why was there such an uproar? I mean, think about it. An extradition bill is announced, and people are outraged, and they're still outraged. There were 1 million people who hit the streets on June 9th, the first demonstration. There were probably 2 million. These are the protesters' estimates. The government's estimates are always less. There were 2 million who hit the streets on June, I think the date is June the 12th. And June the 12th was an important date. That was a Wednesday when the Legislative Council meets in Hong Kong. And they surrounded the Legislative Council and refused to let legislators go in because that was the date set for the second reading of this bill. And the bill was a kind of a crummy bill. It was not well thought out, even if they were going to go through with it. Carrie Lam has said this was my idea. I was responding to the Poon family and this kind of stuff. We now know from a Reuters article that's not exactly accurate. China has been chagrined that there's no way to get criminals who have fled China back to China from Hong Kong, or people they regard as criminals, including some booksellers who were, by our standards, not at all criminals, but there are others. And you may have noticed, I don't know whether it was Julian Assange or Snowden, one of those guys, they ended up in Hong Kong as well. We don't have extradition treaties with a lot of places. So they were outraged. And to illustrate this, I go back to one of my years at Columbia College in the late 60s when dinosaurs roamed the campus at Morningside Heights. I had a beloved professor, Samuel Coleman, and we studied revolutions because we were all revolutionaries in those days. And he said, if you look carefully, revolutions are a study in disappointed expectations. Disappointed expectations. So using that as a focal point, what were the disappointed expectations? But there were many. The whole issue of one country, two systems, how can a totalitarian regime, or that's the most uncharitable view. And I have to say, during the period of the 80s and the 90s, China was opening up and was flowering in a way that was very encouraging to Westerners. In fact, the State Department's view of China was that they're eventually going to be just like us, which is wrong. It didn't happen. Instead, we have Xi Jinping, who's been there, I believe, since 2013, who did away with elections to the head of China. He's just like Mao was. He's there forever, and he's a strong man. So, why were they so disappointed? And the answer is that although there have been a lot of victories along the way, namely no national education, there's much more representation in the Legislative Council than we ever had before. There's still no treason and sedition law in Hong Kong. There was a feeling that Beijing was encroaching on Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy. You can't use the word sovereignty because that's a no-no. China would never tolerate, and will never tolerate, in my opinion, any Hong Kong independence movement. And in fact, two legislators, I think in this past year, or maybe it was not 2018, they were elected in Hong Kong, and they wouldn't take the oath of office to be loyal to the Hong Kong people, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, and to the People's Republic of China. And not only that, the woman involved worked her pledge to say, I will only be loyal to Hong Kong, which is a special administrative region of the something like F-word Republic of China. None of you know this, and I didn't either till I learned about it, but China was a very derogatory word for Chinese from the Japanese. So it was very insulting what she did to China. And they wouldn't seat her. You can see the video online. The guy leading the swearing-in ceremony said, you've changed the oath of office, so I can't seat you. And that was appealed, and it went immediately to the Standing People's Committee, the People's Standing Committee. And there are cases where they don't have to wait. If there are exigencies, they don't have to wait for an appeal from the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong. And they said, you're out. You won't take the oath, you don't get seated, which actually is not unreasonable. I don't know how any of us would feel if someone refused to take the oath of office and being sworn in as either a senator or a representative in the U.S. Congress. I don't think we'd take it very lightly. So this was kind of the proverbial last straw, that there's more seeping going on that they're comfortable with. Meanwhile, let's step back and look at Hong Kong. Has it been awful there? No, not at all. And to give you some, I hope I don't talk too long. Oops, my watch is here. To give you some perspective, imagine a place where the government ends most, but not all years, but most, say 80 to 90%, in surplus. There's no debt. The government has no debt. Where there's no income tax. The tax on individuals is called a salaries tax. And that's what it is. It's the only category of income that's taxed is salaries. And the rate is 15%. And the first 188,000 Hong Kong, which is about 23,000 US dollars, is free of tax. And you have dependence allowance as well. Do you think that would help? And so as a result, 80% of the working people in Hong Kong don't pay any tax at all because they don't make the minimums, or they're just barely over them. This government also, as we speak, is holding US dollars $443.7 billion in foreign currency reserves for 7.5 million people today. 443. It's number 10 on the list if you count the EU. If you remove the EU as a whole, it's higher. And there's 7.5 million people. It's an extremely successful place. It ranks number 1 in the, I think it's the Fraser Institute of Freedom list. The US in that particular list is number 17. It's up there, there's another free capitalism list, which is also number 1, and it's number 3 in some other, some other survey of freedom and of economic freedom. It's a very successful place. What are the problems you hear about? High land costs. Well, which no one ever writes about, I figured this out in 1989, is the following. How can the government, which doesn't seem to have much tax revenues, and by the way, there's virtually no import duties. The only articles that are dutiable are automobiles at 100%, tobacco products, and hard liquor having an alcohol content of 30% or more. So wine and beer is free of tax. And there's some other category which is minor. So how can the government end most years in surplus? 4 or 5 years ago, they made so much money that they paid a kind of dividend to every citizen, or at least every taxpayer. I got back about $600 for paying taxes. Pretty good. And the answer is that the government owns the land in Hong Kong. And from the mid-19th century, they have placed out at public auction, parcels of land that are not enough, to be honest, to meet the needs of Hong Kong. So they keep the supply tight. When I started buying old apartments there, I was intrigued because you'd be on a street in the mid-levels, and here's new building built 4 or 5 years ago, and the price per square foot was double an old so-called colonial building built in the 50s or 60s next door. How could that be? It's the same place. Oh, I was told, the Chinese like new property. Yeah, they may like new property, but it's more than that. The government has a conveyor belt system where the developers, the big developers, and sometimes they join up, they buy large sites and they redevelop them. They typically they may hold some units, or they may sell off commercial or residential units as condominium type units. And people who buy those, the banks are encouraged to lend to the developers, number 1, and the banks are encouraged to lend up to 90% to the end users who are taking the supply off the hands of the developers. So it's a clever conveyor belt that takes raw land, moves it into development, moves it into the hands of people, and the government makes anywhere from 28 to 33% of its budget every year from land sales. Can you imagine in this country, the federal government still owns millions and millions and millions of acres. We had in the 19th century the complete opposite. We said 40 acres and a mule. Go settle the place. The land is free. We don't care. And as a result, there are high land prices in Hong Kong. If you build a skyscraper in New York, the land price is typically around 1/3 of the total project cost. But that same skyscraper in Hong Kong, the land cost is 2/3 of the total project cost. You get the point. Very expensive land. But people cope. How do they cope? First of all, they live in smaller places. Secondly, since a giant shantytown fire in 1954, the government has had a very, very active program of public ownership and of public residential properties that are leased at low prices. The percentage of people who own their homes in Hong Kong is 53%. The percentage of people who live in government housing at a reduced rate of rent is about 25%. And the percentage of people that own their property or buying what's called the home ownership scheme, the HOS, where the government builds properties and sells them to citizens at a 40 to 50% discount to the then market rate, is another 10%. There are for sure complaints about expensive properties in Hong Kong, but they've been there since I arrived in July of 1978. It's nothing new. In a territory that grew from 600,000 to 6.5 million from 1945 to 1997, of course, property's been playing a catch-up game. There used to be on Bowen Road where I live shanties, people living in homemade cardboard and plywood shanties right along the street. So I'm not trying to say that it's not a problem. It is a problem, but it's not why people are in the streets. So that's what has caused the problem. What's become alarming to people is a number of things. One is the violence that's taken place. This started probably around, there's always been some violence, but all of a sudden on July 1st, the Legislative Council building was invaded by armored, helmeted, and armed protesters and sacked. Just sacked. I mean, they spray painted portraits of colonial governors. They overturned things. They didn't light it on fire that I'm aware of, but it was an enormous act of vandalism. And this has gone on. And when you talk to that element, and let me fast forward a little bit, because a lot has happened, and I'm not going to review every single incident. But to date, at least as of about last week, there have been 6,500 people arrested for various offenses. And most of them are violent offenses. Well, I shouldn't say that. They're violent offenses, and they're people just, not obeying, doing what they should be doing. And pay attention to this figure. 6,500, 2,000 are under the age of 18 or 19. They're kids. And a certain percentage of that are high school kids, as young as 13 and 12. Another 2,500 are in their 20s and 30s, and then another 2,000 are everybody else. The vandalism that's gone on and the violence, to me, is unacceptable. And I have to tell you something. They remind me a bit of the Red Guards. They will not criticize their own. They have 5 demands, which I'll go through in a moment, but they believe in solidarity, and there are certain elements in the Western press. I've seen at least 2 video interviews of people who describe them as freedom fighters. This is like solidarity in Poland and like the Hungarian freedom fighters. And the violent protesters and the people who both support them and defend them make no distinction between I shouldn't say that, they make little distinction between a peaceful way and a violent way. One big problem for them, the violent protesters, is that there's no leader. There's no leader. They have 5 demands. The first demand was the withdrawal of the extradition bill, which happened in 2 stages. It was suspended in mid-June, June 15th, and then finally on September 5th, Carrie Lam said she pulled it, which was a surprise to everybody. But then their answer is 5 demands, not 1 less. What are the other demands? They want an independent commission to look into police brutality, which I'll get to in a moment, but not to look into their own brutality and their own violence. The third demand is what? Oh, yes, that this was an early demand, which has become more or less irrelevant, that those arrested on June 12th, at the beginning of the protests, and charged or threatened with the charge of rioting, which has a 10-year prison sentence, should be excused from that they don't. And the next point is total amnesty for everybody arrested. Nice if you can get it. And the last is universal suffrage, which means the continuation of the sort of previously suspended process of voting, having the electorate vote for the chief executive and for the rest of the legislators in the Legislative Council. The chief executive's election, as I mentioned, the next one will be March of 2022. It's on a 5-year cycle. The Legislative Council's next election will be September of this year. So it's going to be very, very interesting. The district council elections took place, as most of you will have read, on November 24th. What are they? They don't do much. They are concerned with local sanitation and local it's almost like a neighborhood council, but it clearly became a surrogate for a vote of confidence or no confidence in the government. And the pro-democracy voters and people supposedly flew in from outside Hong Kong to vote for these, vote in these elections, achieved wins in 17 of the 18 district councils. The only one where they didn't was a tiny one involving a bunch of islands to the west of Hong Kong, which is not very consequential. It was a major blow to Beijing. It was a sign that this thing is not over in any way, shape, or form. And it was widely believed to be the reason why Beijing pulled out its representative in Hong Kong, Mr. Leung, and replaced him with a new guy, Mr. Loy, who just showed up Tuesday, 2 days ago. I hold some hope out for Mr. Loy. This is a guy who he's above the age of 65 and was already being put out to pasture, but he had a successful track record in dealing with, I think it's Qinghai province near Tibet, and dealing with Shanxi province as a practical, pragmatic, problem-solving guy who would come up with different solutions to try to solve the problem. This is a giant problem for Beijing. Why is it a giant problem? Well, some people say, this is the feud. This is like the Sons of Liberty in the 1770s. This is going to light the fuse that's going to blow up China. I have to tell you, I don't believe that. What we see is rather the opposite. People in China think Hong Kong people are spoiled, coddled, and they've become anti-mainland Chinese. There are real problems with mainland students in the universities. We have 18,000 overseas, non-Hong Kong students in the 8 government-funded universities. 12,000 are from the mainland. And they are, we know who they are. I've actually spoken to a class once. They're smart. They're actually smarter than the Hong Kong kids in the class. Their English was better, they were better read, and they asked smarter questions and more questions in a speech I gave once. But they're under the microscope now. Tourists, we have 60 some odd million tourists a year coming to Hong Kong. A lot of them are day trippers. 51 million of them are from the mainland. And they spend a lot of money. They like buying Gucci goods and luxury products in Hong Kong. Guess what? Not because it's cheaper. It's more expensive because we have very high property prices which flow through to the cost of goods. It's because of the receipt that says Hong Kong. Because now they're sure it's not a fake, if you can believe it. This is a counteraction to 20 years ago where people would go to China to get fake Rolexes. They don't want fake Rolexes. They don't even want to go to the authorized Rolex store in Beijing or Shanghai and buy a Rolex because there's always a risk that it's a fake, even though there probably isn't. They have a cautious eye to both Chinese products and to foreign products distributed in China. It's a big part of the economy. One of my beefs with the protesters, and I meant to circulate this. These are a couple pictures. Is they're hurting Hong Kong in many ways. And in particular, they're hurting blue-collar people and working-class people in Hong Kong. Are they hurting me? No. I live in Bowen Road in the mid-levels. My driver drives me to work. My office is about 2 blocks up from Central, where there have been demonstrations, but nothing where I am. And it sounds peculiar. Susan knows who came out in November. I have not yet, to this day, heard with my own ears or seen with my own eyes a protest demonstration. I got to go look for it. I got to go find it. It's not to say they're not there. It is there. But the people who have to get in on the mass transit railway, which is a fantastic air-conditioned, Wi-Fi serviced system, the subway system, you can't get pushed on the tracks because they're sliding glass doors. 85 of the 94 stations of the MTR have been trashed by protesters. Well, why did they do that? This started for probably 2 reasons. One, it's still, I think, 75% owned by the Hong Kong government, but it's fantastic. It's been a lifesaver for Hong Kong. But there was an incident in Leung, which is way up north in the boonies, in the New Territories, on July 21st, where about 100 white t-shirted anti-protester guys beat up protesters returning from a protest demonstration. And they were vicious. They beat up protesters, they beat up some innocent people on the train. It was ugly if you've seen the videos. And so the complaint was, where's the police? Well, Hong Kong has now 31,000 police, and most of them were tied, or a lot of them were tied up dealing with the protests in the other parts of town. And it took a while, it took about 45, 50 minutes for them to get up to Yuen Long and to help out there. They're just stretched. It's a talk about a thin blue line. It's definitely a thin blue line. The protesters and their supporters hate the police. And you'll read stuff in the papers here which describe them all as a bunch of stormtroopers and Nazis. And to me, it's way, way over the top. I won't deny that there are certain individuals in the police, and some of them have been arrested, who've gone too far, but they're exhausted. They're being doxxed, if you know that term. Most people our age don't know the term, but it means they look them up, they find out where they live, they find out what schools their kids go to, and then they harass them. And it's just completely awful. The police are accused of brutality as if they instigated it, but they're not. What happens is the protesters go to the government, they ask for a permit to have a peaceful march. The government gives it, in most cases, under certain circumstances, this area for this time period. Okay. And what happens towards the end of the march, out come the radicals who are armed and who are dangerous. They're lethal. And they are the ones who start throwing things at the police, and of course then the police respond. Raise your hand if you know how many protesters have been killed by the Hong Kong police, or you want to venture a guess. I can't hear. 10. Anything else?
0.
The answer is 0. Not one. Not one. Of those 6,500 arrestees, it's largely a catch and release process. I don't want to say that they're out of the woods completely, because they take their names, their details, so forth. They'll be processed by the legal system later. But the initial punishments for people who are violating, sort of protesting peacefully but violating some order, have been a slap on the wrist or nothing. The ones they're after, those who go with Molotov cocktails. You may have read in November, both the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Polytechnic University were taken over by students and non-students, a lot of non-students. And there was a standoff of 11 days, particularly at Hong Kong Polytech. When the police went in, they found a total, an aggregate in both places, of 12,000 Molotov cocktails, petrol bombs, 1,000 portable gas canisters, which were used to heat up and light, to blow up, bows and arrows, one guy, one gun, not in the university, but beforehand. And the police worked, to be honest, they worked with kid gloves, in my opinion, to get people out. They allowed volunteers to go in and attend to them. There's been huge destruction. The MTR has announced that they have suffered over the summer and fall, what in US dollar terms, about $200 million US of damage. People go in there and break the turnstiles, smash the glass walls. It's just on, and there's nothing to stop them except the Hong Kong police. God forbid the police put on a strike one day and say, we can't take it anymore, you handle it. We're in a state of Hobbesian anarchy there. So, question?
Where did this freedom come from? Until I heard you speak tonight, I thought that the Communist Party ruled with a totally iron fist. That it would never allow this kind of demonstration. You said it granted permission for demonstrating.
Let me repeat the question. Where did this freedom come from? This freedom is enshrined in the basic law. The statement that the Communist Party is running Hong Kong is false. There are about 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers of the People's Liberation Army in Hong Kong, but the rules of the road are they're not allowed to wear their uniforms outside of their base. They've shown up twice in the past year. One in 2018, when Typhoon Mangkhut hit Hong Kong, they went out and helped clear the roads. And secondly, in a road that was right in front of their base in the New Territories, they went out and cleared the road wearing T-shirts. And you should have heard the criticism of that. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So Hong Kong is run as it was before under the British, with a couple of the differences for another 28 years, until 2047. Yeah.
Are you a U.S. citizen
I'm no longer a U.S. citizen for unrelated reasons.
since 79?
No, it's nothing to do with Hong Kong. Since 93.
And can you just, I'm sorry, forgive my lack of whatever you said. Can you just very briefly bullet point the reasons that they're protesting again?
They say they have 5 demands, okay? And I went through them a moment ago.
Those are the 5 demands.
Those are the 5 demands. They're non-negotiable. The reality is they could be negotiated. I'm going to repeat them for you. I'll just write them down. First, the withdrawal of the extradition bill. That's been done. Okay? That leaves 4 demands. Secondly, that there be established an independent commission of inquiry into the Hong Kong police brutality, but not, of course, the protesters. Hong Kong already has the Independent Police Complaints Council, the IPCC, which the current government position is that that's enough. There's probably some flexibility there. There's been discussions that, yeah, we could set up a new independent commission, but it is independent, and it's run by a guy I know called Anthony Niao. The third is an end to referring to the protests on June 12th as rioters. Carrie Lam or somebody called them rioters, and that's bad because if they're arrested as rioters, they're subject to up to a 10-year prison term. The next is full amnesty for all those arrested. That one I think is going to be a tough one. Although when you read the papers and you see who's being handled roughly by the courts, it's almost nobody. There are people, they're out on bail on their own recognizance with instructions not to go to protest areas and to observe a curfew at night. It's not exactly, brutal, but by Hong Kong standards, it's unusual. And then the last is universal suffrage, which is continue the one man, one vote for both the chief executive and for the members of the legislative council. Yeah.
Bob, you've given us an excellent review of the historical setting, but do you have some sense of what the ultimate resolution of the difficulties might be?
I knew you were going to ask that question, and I knew I have to address it. It's hard to say.
Can you repeat that so
The question is, what will the ultimate resolution be of all this? Here's the problem. If you look at the four entities involved, the PRC itself, the Hong Kong government, and the police, and then the protesters, which are both radical protesters and regular protesters, that's five. They're all boxed in. Everybody's boxed in his own box. It's very hard at the moment to find some wiggle room. Starting with the protesters. 5 demands or nothing. They've said, if you're going to burn us, we'll burn everything down with us. Okay? Very un-Hong Kong-like, I have to tell you. During the colonial period, we used to say, people say, what are Hong Kong people like? I said, they just want to make money. They're completely apolitical. Not anymore. These youngsters, I guess, woke up and Googled the fact that they were born in China, and they don't like it.
Do you think it's an influence of the Arab Spring?
No.
Social, yeah.
No, I don't. Let me continue. The police, we have 30,000 police. They're understaffed. Police overtime is already at, what was the figure? $50 million over the summer. Regular law enforcement activity has been put aside. It raises a problem, how much burglaries are going to go up and so forth, things like that. They are under a huge amount of pressure. They're holding the line for everything. If they quit, then we're in a state of anarchy in Hong Kong. The government has to both try to make nice with the population, which has zero confidence in them. The one thing that virtually everyone in Hong Kong will agree is that they hate the government. They don't believe in them. They don't have any confidence or faith in the government, almost from every side. And the PRC, and this is interesting, is concerned about Taiwan besides Hong Kong. Why? Because 2 days from now, there's going to be an election in Taiwan. The current president is Mrs. Tsai, and she was a complete write-off about 6 months ago. In her party, she wasn't even sure she was going to get renominated, but she has been campaigning on a pro-independence, forget one country, two systems for Taiwan, because look what's happening in Hong Kong. And she's 15 points ahead in the polls, and I think you'll see when you wake up Sunday morning that she's won the re-election in Taiwan. And Beijing is in a conundrum because it's a mandate to recover the Chinese territories. It doesn't have to be, they play the long game for sure. It doesn't have to be this year. But that's why I think they're very concerned. And that's why I think they sent this Mr. Louis there, because they need someone to give it a fresh look and figure out a way to try to resolve the crisis. Let me make one other point about one country, two system. Let's say the Chinese had not interfered at all. Zero. And it said, oh, okay, Hong Kong, you can commit treason against the PRC, even though you're within our borders, so no Article 23. What happens on June 30th, 2047? I mean, then you don't even have a glide path to that date if it's going to be taken over by China. And we're going to face this issue not on June 30th, 2047. We're going to start facing it in 2027. That's 20 years before 2047, and we're back to the mortgages expiring. Are we going to have continuation of the common law in Hong Kong? Some people say yes, Britain had a socialist period and common law continued, but we don't know that. Nobody knows that. So it's very, very tricky. There's not a lot of wiggle room for everyone in their various positions. Go ahead.
Is somebody funding this, or is it
Oh, yeah.
spontaneous?
No, well, it's being funded by GoFundMe sites both in Hong Kong. China complains that there are foreign actors funding them. I don't doubt for a minute, including our own government is probably involved, and I'm not that type of conspiracy person. The problem is I've seen photos over the summer of guilos, people who look like security type guys with crew cuts, standing next to protesters with their shields and their armor and their helmets, somehow, counseling them. I don't know. That hasn't been discovered. A 70 million Hong Kong dollar fund, let's call that about 9 million US, was frozen at HSBC in Hong Kong 2 weeks ago or so, because it was being handled in a highly irregular manner. And this was set up by people supporting the protesters. The result for HSBC, they've been smashed. They've had their ATM machines walloped. The 2 lions, if you know them outside the building there, have been splashed with paint and one was set afire. And now, they're the bad guys. Hong Kong is divided now between the yellow team and the blue team. The yellow team is the protester team. And there are restaurants and shops that they have online applications you can go to that say only buy from these guys. And the blue team gets smashed. These are mainland institutions, Xiaomi and Huawei in the electronics area, Bank of China, and of course the MTR, the other transport, the bus system, even taxi system, they're just vandalized. And the protesters are very fond of saying, "Be like water." This is a Bruce Lee term. In other words, move in and then come out. Well, that's great. It's very romantic and evocative. But it also illustrates the fact there's no headquarters and there's no head of the protest movement. Some social scientists or political scientists did a study of protest movements that have heads and have no heads. And he said the success rate is about 55% for those that have someone you can talk to, and it's about 20% for those that don't have anyone to talk to. So I don't know what's going to happen. They have enormous support among the people. Excuse me. The November 24th election showed that there was massive support. There's no silent majority out there among Hong Kong people, but there are layers of kind of commitment towards them. 20% will say, "I believe in violence." These are heroes. They're on the what's the word? The barricades. This is the beginning. And some of them say, this is going to ignite and it's going to light up China. We're starting a democracy fuse in China. There are others say, well, I don't support using gasoline bombs, Molotov cocktails, but it's okay to use laser pointers, or this kind of thing. And then others say, well, I don't really like the violent means that they're using, but I'm on the fence about it, and then a smaller number that are opposed to it. Sorry, question?
I'm sure you're very concerned about the economy, and I'm wondering how seriously this has affected both business and leisure tourism, and how you see it coming back eventually.
Question about the economy, business, and leisure tourism. It's hurt. I think I mentioned already, that tourism's down about 40%. Who's hurting? Restaurants, hotels. There are three-star hotels that have rooms for $20 a night. Who ferries people around? Taxi drivers. And all the workers involved. There are said to be 1,000 kind of guest homes, like Airbnb type, but commercial enterprises that are going to go out of business. Who's it hurting? As I said, it's not hurting me. I don't have the type of business there that has a presence. I have a headquarters there, but it's definitely hurting. None of that actually matters in the big picture as much as Hong Kong is an international financial center. You hear stories of expatriates saying, "I'm going to go to Singapore, I'm going to move back to," but there's no alternative in China. Shanghai will not be. Singapore is, but you don't have you have a giant. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange was the world's #1 stock exchange this year, or for a good part of the year anyway. You have an enormous infrastructure of not just banks and a convertible currency, but a system of law. You have that in Singapore, and auditors and accountants and lawyers and you name it, all the services that go along with it, stockbrokers. So I don't see the Hang Seng Index ended the year, oddly enough, up 9.1%. So not too bad.
So
Question.
Are these protesters confined to a certain socioeconomic level?
No. There are a lot of
The people
students.
that live on the peak are not protesting.
No.
College kids maybe, but
No, they're as I mentioned from the arrest records, they're largely younger people, but not. There are plenty of older people. There've been some very dramatic videos of old
none
guys
of them
saying,
are
"I
on
left."
the peak, right?
No,
So
it's not. They're not coming from the peak.
the people that don't have the money, right?
Yes, but they're university educated. A lot of them. They're white collar workers in the business districts. These are not some downtrodden, lower blue collar class at all. That's completely erroneous. They're very middle class. I mean, they may. I haven't counted their incomes, but they're a good slug of middle class people, and they have support of almost everybody.
Any other questions?
Yes, one.
When the British were forced to give up rule of Hong Kong, I thought it was taken over by China.
No.
In no way.
It was under the system that I described. This with Hong Kong, the one country, two systems model, with Hong Kong having the same autonomy it had under Britain, just like Britain had
They
responsibility
have to
for.
have the approval of Peking.
No, it's very similar to what the British had, except the British had it was a democratic country with a very light touch bureaucracy. Yeah, that's not correct.
So would you open a company there now?
It depends on what you're doing. In the retail business, I'd be very worried. And restaurants are hurting. If you're doing what's called trading or import export into China, there's no change.
Manufacturing?
Well, there's not much manufacturing in Hong Kong anyway.
But they do
That
in
all
China.
left. Yeah, that left in the 1980s. Sorry?
What about financial and legal?
It's all there. There's nobody leaving yet. But it's not to say it couldn't erode. It's hurting. What's sad is that it's hurting everybody. The airport, when you used to be, back in the dinosaur era of June of last year, if you were arriving by plane to Hong Kong and you had family or friends or business colleagues, they'd come to meet you in the arrivals hall. No more. Because there was a big airport takeover by the protesters in July that shut down the airport for 2 days. They harassed mainland travelers. And so now you can't get in. You have to wait outside. So there's no one to meet you. It goes on from there. Yeah.
It sounds to me that, what is your point of view, your perspective, because you live on the other side of the world, what is your perspective on this moral degradation of the entire planet? I mean, what you're experiencing now, you've been very spoiled in your country in the past years previously, but now you're jumping into the fold like everyone else because the whole world is erupting in terrible moral, terrible situations all over the world, and you're finally experiencing it in your country. But what is your perspective of it?
Well, I'm more local when I look at it. There are. Yeah, I understand. You can tie it to, did you the one who mentioned Arab Spring and, Brexit and popular movements and so forth. That's not what they're talking about. When you listen to what they say, they're not talking about that. They're
About power, isn't it? It's always about power.
Their three issues are democracy. They all hate the chief executive, who I've met, is not actually, she's not a bad person. And what else? And universal suffrage. That's what they talk about.
Okay.
Thank you.